Hi, my name is Andrea Pasmay, and yesterday I wasn't able to make it for the video conference. However, this is my makeup video. From what I saw, you talked about run-on sentences, commas, splices, and fragments. First of all, I'll talk about run-on sentences because for me that's the hardest thing. This is due to the fact that in Spanish you are able to have a run-on sentence without it sounding wrong or being boring. You can go talking on and on without ending the sentence, and it's not that much of a big deal. However, in English you need to be much more precise of when you start the sentence and when you end it, because you can't go on and on. I found it that this is because readers tend to get bored when they have to read the same thing on and on, and it doesn't end because they aren't able to wrap up the idea. A run-on sentence for me is mostly because I talk about things that I like or do, and I don't use commas, or I don't separate the clauses, the independent clauses, and it's all just a blabbering of words, and then it looks really awful. Yeah. What I learned at school and from what I learned in the video, comma splice is when you don't separate independent clauses appropriately with a comma. And I believe this has to do a lot with the run-on sentences, because you separate run-on sentences by using the same solutions that you use when you have a comma splice. The first and the thing that I tend to do the most is use connectors. The connectors that I use mostly are however, therefore, and, but, and this tends to be easier for me because I find it easier to just put a connector and maybe crop up some of the sentence than to separate both into sentences, because I don't like to have really small sentences, and this becomes really complicated when you have a run-on sentence, because eventually you'll end up having a small piece, and maybe this small piece won't make much sense, so that's why I use connectors. However, I know that you can also separate it with a period and do it to different sentences. This is a little bit much harder for me, but then I also do this. The one thing that I find really hard to do is placing a semicolon. From what I understand, a semicolon is for separating, but at the same time connecting the two sentences, so it's not so far apart one idea from the other. However, I find it really complicated to know when you have to use a semicolon, when you have to use a connector, or when you should use different sentences. I used to think that this was up to you and you decided what you used, but I find throughout the years that sometimes it's better for yourself to read the sentence and then decide what's better. And there is some sentence that there's specific cases in which you have to use connectors or you have to separate the sentence. But once again, semicolons are a big problem for me. Then fragments. I know that fragments are dependent clauses, meaning that they can't stand on themselves because they are either missing a subject or a verb. And from what I saw in the conference and in the video, it's the same thing. You can't have a fragment by itself because it won't make sense as a complete sentence alone. What I do normally to correct fragments is to join them to an independent clause. When you have a dependent with an independent clause, then you are also able to place a fragment, and now it's not a fragment because it's part of the sentence. I heard that fragments also have subordinate words, and then these are subordinate fragments. However, this is not really clear of how what's the difference between a normal fragment and a subordinate fragment. However, fragments aren't much of a big deal for me because like I told you, run-on sentences are a problem, and run-on sentences are the opposite of fragments. So for me, it's much more easier to finish a sentence and to have a whole sentence than to make a fragment. but it's harder to make an appropriate sentence that it's not that long and that it won't bore up the reader. I have some questions. The first one, the how specifically, like what are the specific rules to place a semicolon and when you should or shouldn't place a semicolon. The second one, regarding fragments, when you are having an imperative question, isn't that like a fragment? And why is it that when you have imperative questions or demands, it's like a fragment, but it doesn't count as a fragment? And I think that's all. Thank you.